Well, welcome back to our weekly Bible study series. We're in the Smith and Helway's Formation series. This week we finished the unit on stewardship, and I'm surprised if anybody's still watching, Christie, since the topic this month has been stewardship, but I think we've had a lot of fun and I think we've learned some things. Today we're going to talk about the rewards for being, or the blessings of being a faithful steward, and we're in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. The parable of the talents, which is probably a parable well known to most of us, and yet we need to challenge ourselves with these parables to see through new eyes. This week, as I was beginning my study, I was caught by the first few words in verse 14, which is, "For it is as if a man." For it is as if. And I thought, well, what is Jesus talking about? So I went back to chapter 24 and realized that he's giving this parable in response to two questions from his disciples. You see, he was talking to his disciples about he's getting ready to leave them, but he's also telling them he's going to return. And of course, the disciples, with their limited thinking, are saying, "Oh, so you're coming back. Well, how will we know? What's going to be the sign so we can prepare, obviously? And secondly, when exactly are you coming back?" So the disciples, like you and I, were curious about those two questions. Well, Jesus told them about the signs, but true to his nature, he leaves a little bit of mystery there. He doesn't tell them when he's coming back. So now he's telling some parables in chapter 25, starting with the parable of the bridesmaids, which he talks about at the beginning of the chapter. And so today, he's telling, in today's scripture text, we're getting a second parable to try to answer that question. So, Christy, can you just give us like an overview on this story?
So, Joe, in true Jesus fashion, he tells the disciples a story. And this is the story of the rich man who has 3 slaves, and he calls them together, and he has entrusted them with some property. And he gives one of the slaves 5 talents. He gives the second slave, he gives 2 talents to, and then a third slave he gives 1 talent to. And I think it's a very key thing to see in verse 15 that he uses the phrase, "to each according to his ability." So not everyone was going to get the same disbursement. And then the man went away on a journey for a period of time. And when he came back, obviously a slave, had received the 5 talents. Well, he went off and traded and brought back 5 more. The second slave took his 2 talents and made 2 talents more. And then the third slave went off and took his 1 talent, and he dug a hole in the ground, and he buried the money. So once the rich man came back to hold them accountable, or to have an accounting of what had gone on while he was away, the first slave comes back and says, "Master, here's what I've done." And, of course, he gives him affirmation and says, "Attaboy, good job." The second slave comes back and says, "Oh, and here's what I've done with your money." And he shows them how he has multiplied. And he says, "Great, wonderful job." And then the third slave comes in front of him and basically says, "Well, I was afraid, so I dug a hole, and I just put your money in there, and here's what I have. It's the same thing that you left me with when you went away." And, of course, the master was not very happy with him and did not appreciate the outcome at all. And basically just said, "Hey, you are a lazy person. What do you mean you did not do anything with it?" And he really sort of coaches him and says, "Well, why didn't you invest it? Why didn't you do something look at the example of the other folks. And so basically he was not happy with him, and so he took that talent from him and he gave it to the one with the 10 talents. And so we have the parable of the 10 talents. So Joe, what do you think Jesus was trying to tell his disciples, and certainly what is he trying to tell us with this bit of scripture?
Well, I think that, we can read this as, and I think you and I have already talked about this earlier. This is about spiritual opportunities. That's what I think the story is. I think when he was talking to his disciples, he was saying, take advantage of the spiritual opportunities you're going to have between now and when I return. And, when you think about the idea of talents, what was a talent? Well, a talent was a weight, and it was used to measure against. And we think it was about 75 pounds, and more than likely what would have been piled on the other side of the scale would have been silver. So you got about 75 pounds of silver, and it feels like from what I've read, that would have equated to the wages for a common laborer, about 15 years worth of wages. And so when you hear about the guy getting 1 talent, we got to be careful not to think that that's not much. It was a lot. In fact, if you think about what an average wage earner makes in Raleigh, North Carolina, or in Wake Forest, North Carolina, I don't know, 25,000, 30,000, pick the number. This is about $400,000. So 1 talent in today's market would be about $400,000. So it wasn't a small or insignificant amount of money that the first person gave. Certainly not the third person. They certainly all received something significant. I think, though, that we're not talking about money here when we talk about talents. We could be talking about our abilities. We could actually even be interpreting this as being the gospel. That could have been. And if you think about people, like you said, they got different amounts. That's kind of how it works. We don't all get the same thing. We don't all, and his disciples, they didn't all have the skills. Not everybody was going to be a Peter. So, yeah, I think this is about making the most of your spiritual opportunities. What do you have to add to that?
I agree with you, Joe, that when you look back and you reflect on your life, you have to look back and say, well, okay, are there any things that I would like to do over? And, I can't help but to think that after this third slave appears in front of the rich man, that he probably wants to raise his hand and say, can I have a do-over?
Yeah.
Because he realizes that he really did miss an opportunity. And when you go back and you look at verse, let's say, I guess it's in verse 21, with the phrase of enter into the joy of your master. Well, these other 2 slaves received that affirmation and that joy, and they knew that they had pleased their master, and it brought them joy. Just like when we can make the most of our spiritual opportunities that God has given us, and when we make the most of our talents, we can experience that joy and we can experience that peace. And we have just a wealth of blessing when we utilize what God has given us. And I do think that our talents are everything that God has given us, meaning whatever financial means we may have, or the intelligence that we may have, or the talent that we may have, and it's all unique. We're not going to all get the same cut or slice of the pie, so to speak. And I think it's about we are truly blessed, and we can experience joy when we maximize the opportunities that he has given us. And in this particular parable, the first 2 slaves maximized. The other slave was just lazy and didn't do anything and squandered it away. And how many times throughout the month of October have we talked about squandering things away or not acting responsibly, or being distracted for whatever reason. And you can tell it here that, you know, he missed out on a real big blessing. He missed out on the joy that he could have brought his master. And ultimately, we miss out on the joy that we can bring the Lord if we just turn our backs and don't do anything and just sort of cruise through life. How about you, Joe?
Well, I think you nailed it. I mean, the central question this week is, what are the blessings of faithful stewardship? And we've kind of led up to this, and I agree totally with you. Enter into the joy of your master. That says to me that when we take advantage of our spiritual opportunities, we experience, you know, the peace and we experience the joy that God intends for us to when we find ourselves in His will. I was taken back a little bit, or I guess one of the things that grabbed me this time through, because certainly this is a parable we're all familiar with, but I got thinking a little bit about, you know, the guy with 5 talents and the guy with 2 talents. They both experienced the same reward, even though you could say, well, the guy with 5 talents had more responsibility, or he had to work harder, or he produced more. But that's one of the things we've learned this month in our stewardship study, is that in God's economy, God only holds us accountable for what we can do with the opportunities He gives us. And so both the first and the second person got the same exact blessing. And so I find there's something very comforting in that, to know that God only holds us accountable for what we can do. But finishing up with kind of our third idea here, to your point about the third person wanting the do-over, there's a real warning to us, I think. And, you know, the question I came away with was, why do you think this third servant or slave, or why did this third person dig a hole and stick the money in there? You know, why did they do that? And what is the warning to us? Any thoughts on that, Christie?
Now, you know, there's a part of me that thinks maybe he was just lazy. He says he did it out of fear. I don't know, that seems like an excuse to me. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he was just selfish and just thought, I don't have time for this. I know that this is a lot of money, so I'm just going to go put it in the hole. Here's the thing. I'm going to break even. I'm going to give him back the exact same amount. So how bad could it be? I haven't lost anything, and he's going to break even, so maybe that's the lesser of 2 evils. I'm okay. But I really think that it comes down to, just like when there is a time that we will be accountable to God, this slave is going to have to account back to his master. And I think he was starting to get a little shaky about it when he thought, uh-oh, this is not going so well for me, as he was standing there listening to all of the other praise, and he thought, uh-oh, my number's coming up, and I didn't do too good. If you squander away your talents, you're going to miss the joy. And I think that is the warning. I can't help but to think he would want to have a do-over. I just think it was a huge disappointment, not only to the master, but I can't help but to think it would be a disappointment to him, looking back going, I wish I should have done that when I had the chance. And now he won't get that chance again. What about you, Joe?
Well, you know, that was my takeaway from the lesson this week, exactly what you're saying. You know, it dovetails so well into our story last week of the rich man and Lazarus. You know, the rich man ended up in the wrong place, not because of something he did, but because of something he didn't do. And I read something this week that kind of grabbed my attention connected to this lesson. It said that when we're young and we have regrets, it's usually about things we've done. We regret things that we did, things that we said, that type thing. As we get older, our regrets are about things we didn't do. And so what I see here almost is, the takeaway from this is don't blow it when you're given spiritual opportunities, because one day you may regret not having taken advantage of it. I'm with you. I think the slave who gives us the wrong example here, whether he was lazy, whether he was distracted, not sure, but I can tell you for us today, as modern Christians, distraction is probably our enemy more than it is laziness. I mean, we are, particularly in our church, I would say we are a group of doers. We're very active. We're quick to, knock things off the list. We accomplish much. I think we have to be careful not being so distracted because of our success that we miss spiritual opportunities, and we end up like this person one day regretting what we didn't do. That was my takeaway from this week. Did you have one in particular?
I think that for me, it's no matter what you're given, and whether it's much or if it's little, that God's going to equip you for whatever that calling is that He has for you. No matter how big, how small, He's going to equip you, and that's going to help you be able to capitalize on all of these opportunities that we have. I certainly don't want to spend my time when it's time for me to go to heaven and I'm standing at the gate, Joe. I don't want to stand there and say, God, I wish I had done this, or I wish I had done that. I don't want to look back at my life and say, boy, look at all these missed opportunities, or look at all these things that I didn't do for someone. I hope I can give a better accounting. And so for me, I think this was about making me pause and stop and think about, am I stepping out and making the most of every opportunity that God puts in my path?
Awesome. Well, listen, we appreciate you folks being here. Christy and I have really enjoyed being with you this month during the stewardship lesson. We'll be back again next week, and next week we're going to start a new unit on the book of Ruth. So, Christy, I don't know if you've ever taught Ruth before, but I'm sure I've had samplings of it throughout, but boy, it's always like a rediscovery when you get into some of these books. So come back and join us next week, and we look forward to being with you. Until then, God bless you. Have a great week, and we'll see you again next time.